let me first of all introduce myself. I'm Alison Gowman and I chair the Livery Climate Action Group. And this seminar is being run by the Livery Climate Action Group. We've invited both the people who represent each of our livery company members, we call them our SPOCs, our single points of contact. But we've also opened this up because of the interest of the topic to a wider group of people. So there are friends and colleagues from livery companies, from the city corporation, etc. So thank you all for attending. So as you know, the presentation tonight is going to be on decarbonising the River Thames. I think so many of us love the Thames and we all think, why isn't it used more? And then when you look at it, it actually is used quite a bit. There's a lot of traffic and we do actually have a port as well. And the Port of London Authority, who have major powers over the River Thames, also have a decarbonisation plan. And they've been talking about it over the last few months, working on it for longer. And I thought it'd be great to have the Director of Sustainability and Net Zero Transition to talk to us about their plans, because they're so adjacent to what we're doing in the city. So that director is Grace Rawnsley, who you can see on the screen. Grace and I do go back a few years because prior to joining the Port of London Authority, the PLA, Grace did work at the corporation for quite a few years, particularly latterly on the climate action strategy. So she and I had a lot of work in her latter time at the corporation. So we like to think we've given her all the good skills and interests to take to the PLA, but actually I think they were driving stuff as well, and she's really coordinated. I think you were the first director of sustainability there, weren't you?
Yes.
You actually did take the good practices forward.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, Grace, I've whittled on. We've got a few more people joining us. I'm going to hand to you. You're going to share your screen. So thank you very much, Grace. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Alison. Yes, thank you. And thank you for the lovely introduction. I did work for the City of London Corporation for 13 years, and I worked in a wide range of parts of that organization, including open spaces. And then in my kind of the end of my career was leading on the climate action strategy. And my kind of background is in sustainability and kind of conservation management. And I have to say, when the job came up at the Port of London Authority, it wasn't an easy choice for me to make because I was very happy at the City of London. But what an opportunity to have a career where I worked on the square mile and then the River Thames. So it was a bit of it was an excellent leap for me to make, but kept me very close to the corporation and kept me very close to the square mile as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the PLA itself, Port of London Authority itself. I know some of you will be familiar, but some of you might not be, and what our remit is, and then do a little bit of discussion around our goals around decarbonisation, as well as looking at the other side of the climate coin, which is climate resilience and adaptation. And at the end, I'll also just maybe go over some of the wider initiatives that we do on the environment in terms of pollution, water quality, air quality, and biodiversity as well. So I think there is a bit of a delay on my slides. Let me just see if hopefully that's coming up for you. So just to kind of go over what we do. So we are the kind of the authority that looks after the River Thames, primarily from a navigational perspective. And we have an incredible river. It's 150 kilometers or 90 miles of fast flowing water, and it's tidal. And we are responsible for the tidal section of the River Thames, which goes up to Teddington Lock and then out into the North Sea, into the estuary in the North Sea. And that is a huge kind of jurisdiction, runs all the way through London, many riparian boroughs that border upon our river that we work with very closely. And in order to kind of make our work a bit more coherent, we have divided the river into 3 sections, and those sections are divided around the kinds of activities that we find in those sections of the river. So we have our upper reaches, which is kind of Teddington Lock up into when we start getting into the city, kind of Putney Bridge probably. And that area is very much typified by your kind of recreational users. So we have lots of paddle boarders, a lot of kayakers and rowers, as we're talking about the rowing today. And so it's a very green and leafy part of the river as well, and very picturesque. We then move into the kind of central part of the river, and that is kind of typified by passenger transport as well as inland freight transport. So a very, very busy part of the river, but a very different type of user. And then from the Thames barrier out into the estuary, that's kind of our industrial zone. So we call it the lower reaches, and that's where you have all of our big terminal operations on the river. And each of those different parts of the river has very different stakeholders and very different interests. And so we have a big team of people who look after that element of what we do as well in terms of how we best serve the communities that live and work along the river. I should say that it's important to note as well that the Port of London itself is a what's called a trust port. So we have no shareholders. We operate entirely for the benefit of the port and the river now and in the future. And so it's quite a different model. It's more akin to probably a public sector model. But we are told through our kind of act of parliament and our guidance from government that we do need to act commercially, but that those commercial returns need to be funneled back into the work that we do to create a safe, sustainable, and fantastic port as well as river. And that's actually kind of unique in the port sector. I don't know very many other kind of models that work like that, but it actually gives us a huge amount of scope to do things and to really make impact. And I think it's actually a fantastic model. It feels almost a bit like a unicorn model, if I'm honest. And Alison said that it's actually a very busy port. So the Port of London is the largest port in the UK by volume of goods that comes through. On average, about 50 million tons of cargo goes through the Port of London every year. And that is coming through about 70 different terminal operations along the port. It's probably important to note that the Port of London, we don't actually run any terminal operations ourselves. Those are done by independent organizations, but we support the licensing of all of those operations on the river, and we would support the safe passage of vessels to those terminals as well. The port is also incredibly diverse in its cargo, and that's one of the strengths of the Port of London, and one of the reasons that it did well, for example, during COVID, when certain industries were hit and others were actually, saw an increase in volume. And it gives us a really good element of resilience, which is actually very important for a trust port because we don't have any shareholders that back us. We have to be able to be completely self-sufficient. We don't get any government funding either. So we have to be completely self-sufficient. So having a diversified portfolio of trade is really important in order to be able to weather some of those storms. And you can see here that we're actually, and actually what I don't have is year on year, but containers is one of our big areas of growth. I'm sure many of you will have heard that we have London Gateway up in the estuary that is expanding. They're opening new berths, taking in more container traffic. And so we'll see a big increase in containers through that development. But we're also a really key port for aggregates and cement. And that's really important in the backdrop of the government's ambitions around growth. Having terminals on the river that can bring in aggregates is very important for the Southeast in terms of keeping up with the demand for that growth. And if we look then kind of more towards the middle and upper reaches of the river, we have a very different portfolio of activity that happens, but we are actually the UK's most busiest inland waterway as well as the largest port. So we move about 3.1 million tons of freight up and down the river inland. And that, and actually the City of London have are an organization that uses that movement of freight on the river through moving waste from the square mile up to waste disposal facilities. So a lot of demolition waste moves on the river, a lot of waste moves on the river. We also have about 9 million passenger journeys on the river every year. That's both commuters that are going on Thames Clippers, for example, or those that might be going on some of the cruise vessels, the small cruise vessels. And I think crucially, again, we also support about 600 to it's between 6 and 700 a year sporting events on the river. And this can be anything from those kind of historic races that we see on the river, the rowing races, the sailing races. I think maybe some of you might have been involved in sailing barge races, all of those sorts of sporting activities, as well as paddleboard events or kayaking events all the way up and down the river. And I should say as well, there's an area of growth that we're looking at, which is also around how we can help to use the river more for light freight. And again, we see a kind of sustainability argument for doing that. So light freight being packages that maybe are, for example, Amazon deliveries, and how we could use the river more to bring those packages into central London to get those lorries and vans off of the roads and reduce congestion, sorry. So with such a wide kind of range of stakeholders and responsibilities and goals, looking after basically what is one of the most iconic rivers in the world, we needed obviously a very strong vision to underpin that. So back in 2022, I believe, we launched our Thames Vision 2050, which is centered around the three main themes. So that's trading. So we want to see the country's #1 net zero UK trading hub in London. And the second is around destination. So we want the Thames to be a place that people come to visit, that they enjoy living next to, that they connect with. And then also a natural Thames, so one that has clean air, water, and land, and that supports a diverse element of wildlife. And so my role really is to deliver against our natural Thames themes, but also to look at how we support the Net Zero UK trading hub as well. So in terms of how we look at sustainability at the Port of London, we look at it in three ways. The first is how we can improve our own sustainability within the Port of London operations. We also look to how we can enable and improve the sustainability of that 95 miles of tidal Thames. And then the final thing we are looking at all times is how we can support the wider sustainability transition in the UK. And we do that across 4 different themes: climate, air quality, water quality, and biodiversity. I'm going to talk a little bit I'm going to focus in on climate, but I'll talk a little bit about the others at the end to give you a snapshot. So as I mentioned, when we talk about climate, we talk about 2 different aspects of climate. The first is around decarbonisation, and the second is around climate resilience. And they obviously go very much hand in hand because we can't have a decarbonate. Oh, apologies, my little one has just walked in. So we have, so they go very much hand in hand. Obviously, decarbonization is the biggest mitigation we can have for climate resilience, but we still need to recognize that things are changing and things will be changing on the river. And as a result, we need to focus in on that climate resilience piece as well. So if we think about decarbonisation on the river, there are some major challenges on decarbonisation, as well as some major opportunities for the river itself. When I worked at the City of London, we talked a lot about obviously building decarbonisation, which in many ways, and I'm not saying that it's an easier job, in many ways is much more straightforward. The future of maritime decarbonisation and vessel decarbonisation is less defined. There are still a lot of things to be worked through. There are still a lot of technological advancements that we need. And there's still a lot of chicken and egg around future fuels. So what will be the future fuel for the maritime sector? And the maritime sector being what it is, and I know we've got some master mariners on today will know this, it's that it's incredibly wide ranging. We have large ocean-going vessels, the big super container vessels, ultra larges, all the way down to kind of support vessels in the port itself, tugs and workboats. And then all the way up the river, we have different types of vessels as well that will be moving up the river. So the kind of archetypes of vessels and the range of vessels is really extensive, which makes the picture of decarbonisation more of a challenge. And really what we're starting to kind of see through our work is trying to understand what types of maritime vessels will electrify, what types of maritime vessels will be reliant on a future fuel like ammonia or e-methanol or maybe even hydrogen. And where will we see a combination of those two as well? And trying to then support those in our community to understand how to kind of build business cases around that. There's also challenges in that we're a very constrained river. We're in a constrained site. We're in a historic location. It might be easier to do some projects closer out into the estuary, but when we're talking about decarbonising in the centre of London, we are constrained by the fact that we, are in the middle of London. And so thinking about solutions that deal with some of those potential conflicts around space is really important. So how do we work better with local authorities to understand what the river needs in terms of decarbonisation and space in order to do that? And how do we work with local residents as well to understand sensitivities around space and infrastructure? Um, some other kind of opportunities, though, are that decarbonisation on the river has an opportunity to support wider London. We talk about, when infrastructure is required, how do we stack the use cases onto that infrastructure as much as possible so that it supports the widest number of people and organizations possible. And I think that there's a real opportunity there for decarbonisation of London on the river as well. Thinking about how we then might move carbon up and down the river through carbon capture and storage, or we might move heat up and down the river, is a really exciting opportunity to think about how it supports wider London. And then we also have the kind of challenge that all of this in this investment often requires some major capital. And I think anybody who works in sustainability knows that when we get down to those actual solutions, they are kind of expensive and require investment. So again, we're looking at how we might support some of the river infrastructure through helping them access government grants and other types of funding. In terms of climate resilience, sea level rise is something that's definitely front and center in our minds, as well as more extreme weather. We have seen more extreme weather that has impacted us. Storm Dara made it very difficult for our pilots, for example, to get out onto vessels. So we are seeing more of an impact of that extreme weather on port operations. From a climate resilience perspective as well, from a sea level rise and flooding element, we have extensive infrastructure along the river that's protecting London, and I'll go into what that is in a bit. But it's aging, and so there's a need to understand how we can update that infrastructure so that it meets the future requirements. And on that infrastructure along the river is a very complex place in terms of ownership and responsibilities, and navigating that kind of adds an element of challenge to kind of these large infrastructure projects. So just talk a little bit about what we're doing internally at the PLA in terms of our own commitments to achieving net zero. So we have just actually launched our new net zero plan this year. We have two targets, one which is to be net zero in our full value chain. That's scope 1, 2, and 3 for those of you who are into scopes by 2040. And we are on track to deliver that. In terms of our scope 1 and 2 emissions, we have a second target as well, where we would like to have our scope 1 and 2 emissions be counterbalanced or carbon neutral by 2027. So this isn't true net zero. We aren't calling it net zero, but we are kind of recognizing that it's an important step on the journey. And what we will be doing here is we've reduced our emissions significantly, and we will be then using carbon removals from our land holdings to counterbalance that. And I would say when I arrived at the PLA, actually the work that had been done already to transition to a lower carbon fuels was really, really positive. So our entire fleet runs on hydrotreated vegetable oil, and it has a huge impact on our carbon targets and our ability to deliver those particular ambitions. But I think, in many ways, we're a small part of the picture. We don't own any terminal operations where we have a vessel fleet, but it's relatively small in comparison to others. And actually, what's more important is our ability to support the river to decarbonize as much as possible. And so we are working to do that through our Net Zero River Plan, where we convened a group of operators and terminal operators together, as along with the regulators, to understand what the main challenges were to decarbonization across the river. And through that, we developed a joint plan for that group of people, which we call our Net Zero Coalition, which has about 40 members across the river. And these were the key ones, which was that there definitely was a need to support the transition to alternative fuels and green technology. Many operators are well aware of the opportunities, but some aren't as much. And a lot of operators, I'm sure you'll know, are small businesses. They might be family run. They don't have an in-house sustainability director. So things that we can do to help support them is really, really important. Regulation was a major issue that was brought up by our operators as one of their challenges to achieving lower carbon emissions. And so again, we've brought together the regulators in the space to help. And actually, we're running a session, was due to be tomorrow, but it's been cancelled because of the tube strike, with the regulators and our operators so that they can talk through the challenges that regulation faces. And then we also are very aware that the funding and financing of green and alternative fuels is really difficult. And so we're running a number of projects with the aim to unlock some of that funding and financing for the river itself. And then finally, most of our operators felt that data was something that would be really valuable for them. So how can we support them to have the right data for decision making and to support collaboration? And so the first project that we delivered as part of this plan was to develop what we call our maritime emissions portal, which we worked with an organization called RightShip. And this actually gives us a heat map of emissions across the river. We can look at all of the terminals on the river and see what types of emissions are happening at those terminals, what types of vessels are causing those emissions, as well as a kind of down to the granularity of the vessel itself and how much emissions it's producing when it's in our jurisdiction. And this has really helped us kind of be able to share that intelligence with our community to say, all right, this is just a little tweak here, maybe, for example, if you could unload a little bit faster, you might be able to get this vessel out that's polluting more and reduce the carbon emissions that are happening at your site. And it also actually helped us kind of debunk what we thought were some kind of long-held beliefs about where the majority of the pollution and where the majority of the carbon was coming on the river. So we always knew it was kind of obviously going to be situated down in the Gravesend area. But what was surprising to us was actually that the impact of tug operations, because they're out all the time and they're kind of working constantly, they had a much higher impact than we had anticipated. In fact, they were the second highest area of impact, only very slightly nudged for top place in terms of container vessels. So container vessels came out as the most carbon intensive and producing the most carbon within our jurisdiction, but tugs were only very, a very, very small percentage underneath that. And actually, interestingly, obviously, we've got all these big ocean-going vessels. There's only so much influence we can have over them. But tug operations on the river, we have much closer relationships with tug operators on the river. So we've been able to have those conversations about how tugs can transition to cleaner fuels and technologies. Um, the second kind of project that we've been running is a project called Electric Thames, which is looking at how it's a project that's in partnership with UKPN, so that's the electricity distributor, to try and really understand what the power demands of the Thames will be now and in the future as inland vessels in particular start to electrify. We see that inland vessels, one of the easiest or more straightforward route to decarbonization is through electrification. We might see some hydrogen fuel cells in that group as well. But how do we support inland vessels to do that? And how do we at least get on the front foot about knowing what's required and working closely with the DNOs in order to say, actually, there's going to be a requirement here. We're going to need to put some put some energy onto the riverside so that vessels can actually decarbonize. And I know if anybody's worked in sustainability before, they'll know that one of the big kind of um, blockers to achieving electrification is obviously the grid capacity. So it was really important that this project was partnered with UKPN so that we could really understand how to get underneath that. And it's a very much a collaborative project. So we work, as I said, working with that network operator, working with vessel operators, working with peer and key owners as well as local authorities to understand what some of the challenges are. And I think the project's been really powerful because we've actually been able to kind of get down to the peer level and see exactly where we would have to run cables in order to support electrification at those piers, and what vessel archetypes would be using those piers, and what their kind of workflow would be, and how much time they would need to be on those piers, charging, etc. So it's been a very kind of detailed project that's given us a huge amount of intelligence about what's required across the Thames in the future. And this is just a bit of a map of, for example, some of the work that we've done on this, which is a kind of vessel density and the mapping that against where the UKPN have primary substations. So we can see it's a mapping of the electrical supply with the vessels who might need it in the future. And that's probably different than any projects that I've been in that kind of came before, which looked mostly at where the vessels needed the energy, but what they didn't do was look at where the energy was in order to match that up with the vessels. We're also supporting from the kind of international global scale, looking at how we might bring together what are called green shipping corridors. And so these are corridors that are at the moment we're looking at short sea shipping and trying to understand how you might match kind of demand with a vessel and two ports. And the idea being that it's a kind of tool to help um, to help with the kind of future energy demands of the global sector in terms of fuels. At the moment, fuels are available for shipping, but actually part of the problem is getting the kind of scaling up of those fuels enough that they support wider shipping. And so what you have is kind of half of the global fleet is looking at e-methanol, half of the global fleet is looking at ammonia. There's some looking at hydrogen and some other fuels. And so what you need to start having is kind of projects where we start to deploy some of those fuels, so that and end-to-end projects are kind of a nice way of doing that, because with vessels that only travel on certain routes, it de-risks the issue for them. That is, if I choose methanol and I go to a port that doesn't have methanol, what will I do? Well, if you're a vessel that only operates between two ports, if both those ports are on the same page in terms of what they're going to provide, then it makes it a less risky opportunity for you. And what I would say is that, green corridors have a lot of challenges. And, we know through the work that we've done, that I led a task force for the Department of Transport on green corridors, is that they're unlikely to have short-term business cases that make any sense because of the cost of alternative fuels and the cost of infrastructure that's required. But what they can demonstrate is medium-term business cases, so 2030s to 2040 business cases where they wouldn't be reliant on government support in order to kind of continue. And so trying to kind of reframe these green shipping corridors as a medium-term solution is really important, and something that we're trying to do in order to support the development of them in the port itself. So I'm going to quickly talk about climate resilience as well. I'm sure that many of you will know that sea levels are rising, and they are going to be rising by quite a lot by the end of this century. So by 2100, depending on the climate scenario you're looking at, we will see a sea level rise of almost a meter in the worst case scenario, but at least 50 centimeters in the low case scenario. And that is across the world, but it will have a detrimental impact, particularly on coastal regions. And guess where ports are located? They're located in coastal regions. And so actually there will be a kind of global impact on ports that has been kind of quite neatly modeled, and to understand what the types of climate risk are and how they'll impact different parts of the global port sector. And so it is something that's really on the mind of the industry, is how we deal with these sea level rises and how we deal with those more extreme weather events, as they do tend to hit coastal regions more. And I think it's worth noting that London itself is in a floodplain, and this is one of the things that we grapple with regularly at the PLA, is that we are in a floodplain. Um, the If the barriers on the Thames were to not be there, and we would have a large storm, um, should I say, the Environment Agency believes that 1.4 million people would be within that floodplain. And so it's a really, really important thing for us to tackle. 500 educational facilities, 700 healthcare centres are in the floodplain of the Thames. 321 billion in residential property value within that floodplain of the Thames. So really understanding how we protect London from rising sea levels is crucial. And I should say that the PLA are not responsible for this element of work. This is something that the Environment Agency are responsible for. They are responsible for flooding and sea level rise. However, we have to be obviously working hand in hand with them on this because we manage the river. And so through a program called TE 2100, Thames Estuary 2100, they've done extensive work on what needs to happen on the river. But I never do a presentation where I don't talk about this, because I think it needs to be on Londoners' minds. The importance of flood barriers for London can't be overstated. And I should say that we are in jeopardy from a number of different types of flooding on the Thames. So we are affected by high tides, which are just the result of gravity from the moon and the sun and the rotation of the earth. We're also impacted by what are called storm tides. This happens when there's a big storm out in the North Sea, and all the high winds and the changes in pressure cause these big high water levels to come up the river, making the tides much higher than usual. And we're also impacted by heavy rainfall. And sometimes all of those things can coincide at the same time as well, which means that we have a lot of water in the system that we then have to deal with. And we're very lucky in London to have the Thames Barrier. I shouldn't say lucky, because the reason the Thames Barrier is there is because of a major flood where there was a major loss of life. But we're fortunate to have the Thames Barrier in place and which will stop most of this flooding from happening. But it is an aging structure. So these are the current defenses we have along the river. We have a number of floodgates. We have, these are all kind of, the purple lines there are all flood walls that have been constructed, and as well as a number of embankments. And then we have the barrier itself. And we do have actually a number of other barriers on the river as well. So I think there's a picture here of at the top at Barking Creek, maybe, where there is a barrier. And so there's a number of different barriers. It's not just the Thames barrier that is the kind of main flood defense. It's a system of flood defenses that works together. And the problem we're really facing on the Thames is that the flood defenses are aging. So many of them were built as early as the 1800s. And you can see here in this picture the various different times that those flood walls have been raised. So you can see the first one was the 1879 Flood Act. And then we had a big raising of those flood walls in the late 19th century. And then in the 1930s with a reiteration of the Flood Act, we had more raising of the walls, and then 1970s again. And we will need to see raising of those flood walls again in the next 20 years, so that we are protected from those sea level rises. And so what really has to happen across the river is that by 2040, we need a decision that needs to be made on what happens to the Thames barrier. So do we upgrade it? Do we have a new barrier in place? Or do we put flood storage areas and a new barrier in order to kind of hold water where we can? By 2040, we also need to have raised all of the downstream defenses by up to 60 centimeters. And by 2050, we need to have raised all the upstream defenses by 50 centimeters. And that's 2050 is not that long. It's really not that long for the type of major infrastructure that we're talking about here. By 2070, we need to have implemented a new barrier. So we need a new barrier by 2070. And then at the same time, by 2070, we then need to raise all of the downstream defenses by another 100 centimeters. And then by 2090, we need to have raised the upstream defenses by 50 centimeters. Now, while these may seem like big, long periods of time, um, they're really just around the corner when you're talking about major infrastructure. So I think it's something that we're really keen that people kind of have an understanding of and understand the challenges that are faced by these sorts of major infrastructure projects that go all the way through London. Every local authority will need to be dealing with the fact that their flood barriers will need to be raised. And there's a real opportunity to do this in the greenest and most environmentally friendly way possible. But in order to do that, we don't need to be rushing. What we need to be doing is planning that out, understanding what the opportunities are in the various different local authorities, and really taking the opportunity to kind of create amazing public spaces and green infrastructure that support London as a whole. And then finally, I'm just going to talk quickly about the work that we do on other elements of other elements of our of sustainability. We do quite a lot of work on water quality. I don't know if anybody was watching the news in August or if you were all away, but we launched a project in August to clean up Wet Wipe Island, and we've got some before and after pictures hot off the press. So that first picture there shows that there was a kind of a massive accumulation of wet wipes. That's what that grainy, kind of darkish brown substance is. And we went out with some excavators and removed 114 tons of wet wipes, about 5 million. Is a conservative estimate for the number that we pulled out of the river at Hammersmith in particular. So Hammersmith has because of the way that the river moves there, wet wipes have been accumulating over the last 5 to 7 years. We also launched our Clean Thames Manifesto in 2023, which is working with the water companies to try and push them to move faster on their targets that they've committed to for the government, alongside our Clean River Plan, which is a partnership document with many of the local councils, as well as academic institutions and NGOs that work on these issues, to try and kind of collate the action that's happening across the river on cleaning it up. We're also this year going to be launching a water quality monitoring platform for the upper reaches. We're doing a trial of it this year to understand how best to launch that for recreational users of the river. So that will be coming soon. And finally, the other thing we do, which is not on the slide, is we brought in 2024 we brought in General Direction 10, which prohibits commercial vessels from discharging any sewage into the river. We also work on air quality. So this is a major area of work for us. We were the first port in the UK to have an air quality strategy. I chose this slide because we've got a lovely quote from Ruth Calderwood, who's the air quality manager at the City of London, who worked very closely with on this. And our air quality strategy really lays out what we need to do in order to improve air quality. At the moment, the air quality impact of the river is relatively low compared to what's happening on the roads, but we know that that distribution is going to change over time. So the more that we can do to decarbonize those vessels, often those decarbonization methods also result in better air quality. So those two strategies work very much hand in hand. We have an emissions inventory of the river, so we look again at the various different air pollutant emissions and where the concentrations are. And that helps us to target the riparian councils that we want to work with on reducing emissions. And this year, we're also trialing a fuel conditioner in our vessels that aims to reduce the emissions from the tailpipe as well. So we're in the middle of doing trials on that. And then finally, we also have a major focus on biodiversity. This year, fingers crossed, hot off the press, we should be launching a project where we'll be registering an intertidal habitat bank at Bexley as part of what's called biodiversity net gain. So this is where developers would be able to buy credits for habitat units that we create along the river, and it's a way in which we can help to fund some of those major projects that we'd like to do. This picture here is a picture of the West Thurrock salt marsh before we did some major restoration works on it, where we were aiming to improve the salt marsh, and we did that through a really innovative way, which is to create some kind of natural barriers that helped sediment stay in the system. One of the reasons the salt marsh had was in a bad state was because through erosion. So it helps the sediment stay in the system and it helps that salt marsh reestablish. And finally, we'll be developing a biodiversity strategy as well in 2026, partnering with the Zoological Society of London. And so that's a whistle-stop tour. I probably talked way too long, but I had a lot to get through, and I wanted to give you a kind of proper overview of the work that we do.